What if I told you the ending of One Piece was already shown to you in Chapter 1, and every single one of us just wasn't ready to see it? Not a theory, not a guess, but evidence. 27 years, over 1,000 chapters, more than 1,000 episodes, one story. We've watched Luffy punch gods, sail across impossible oceans, lose crewmates, bury brothers, and still keep smiling. But here's what nobody talks about enough. Eiichiro Oda didn't just write One Piece as it went. He architected it, every arc, every fruit, every name, every laugh planned. There's a reason Oda already knew the ending when he started. He said so himself in interviews spanning decades. He knew where this was going before most of us knew what the grand line was, and the proof is buried in plain sight. Because when you go back to Chapter 1, not to read it but to decode it, you realize something that changes everything. Nothing in that chapter was accidental. Not the barrel, not the hat, not the name of the ship, not even the words Luffy says in his very first scene. So today we're going back to the beginning, and this time we're not going to miss it. Let's start with something so simple it feels almost too obvious to mention. Luffy's introduction to the world. His literal entry into the story is from inside a barrel. He's curled up, sealed away, hidden. Now most of us watched that and thought, cute introduction, funny kid, moving on. But think about what a barrel represents symbolically. It's containment, it's suppression, something with potential. Wine, gunpowder, a person, locked away from the world, and the moment Luffy bursts out of it, that's not just a gag scene, that is the thesis statement of the entire manga. A force of nature, compressed by circumstance, exploding into a world that wasn't ready for him. And here's what makes it even deeper. The barrel was thrown into the sea by the very people who feared what was inside it. The party on Higuma's ship didn't know what they were dealing with, they just knew something needed to be contained. Sound familiar? That's the world government's entire philosophy. Put the dangerous things in barrels, seal them away, pretend the sea doesn't carry them right back. But the scene doesn't stop there. The first full image we get of Luffy, before the barrel, in the actual timeline, is a young boy sitting across from a man who doesn't need to say much, because everything he represents speaks for itself. Shanks, red-haired, laughing, wearing a straw hat that doesn't belong to him yet, because it belonged to someone else first, someone who conquered the Grand Line, someone who laughed in the face of death and called it an adventure. That hat has passed through three hands, Roger to Shanks to Luffy, and here's the thing Oda wanted you to feel, but never explicitly say in Chapter 1. A will can be inherited without being explained. Shanks doesn't tell Luffy about Roger, doesn't tell him about Laugh-Tale, doesn't hand him a map or a mission. He hands him a hat, and with it silently, invisibly, everything Roger was, everything Roger found, everything Roger started gets passed on. The ending of One Piece was set in motion not when Luffy ate a devil fruit, it was set in motion the moment that hat changed heads. But that's still just the surface, because what Oda hid in that opening scene isn't just symbolism, it's a structural blueprint, and the blueprint goes much deeper than a hat. Look at how the world government is introduced in Chapter 1, not as a governing force, not as a system, but as a feeling. The Marines who show up in Windmill Village aren't presented as protectors, they're presented as people who look the other way, who tolerate injustice because the injustice doesn't threaten them directly. Oda doesn't write a speech about systemic corruption in Chapter 1. He doesn't need to. He just shows you adults with power doing nothing while a mountain bandit terrorizes a village, and then he shows you a child with no power doing something anyway. That contrast is the entire ideology war of One Piece in 2 pages. Because what we later learn through Dressrosa, Alabasta O'Hara, the Void Century, is that the world government has always operated exactly like those Marines in Chapter 1, not actively evil in every single moment, just selectively blind, strategically indifferent, protecting a structure rather than protecting people. The Marines in that opening scene aren't villains, they're a preview and Luffy's reaction to them. He doesn't argue with them, doesn't appeal to their authority, doesn't ask for their help, he simply acts without them. That is exactly how he will engage with the world government for the next 1,000 chapters. Now here's where it gets architecturally brilliant. Garp is in Chapter 1, Luffy's grandfather, a Marine Vice Admiral, one of the most powerful figures in the entire organization, designed to maintain world order, and he's there not to protect the village, he's there to visit family. Oda is showing you right at the start that the lines between justice and personal loyalty are already blurred at the highest levels of power. Garp loves Luffy, Garp serves the world government, and those two facts are going to be in direct conflict for the rest of the story. Chapter 1 seeds a question it won't answer for hundreds of chapters. What happens when the system you serve becomes the thing you should be fighting? That question is Garp's entire arc, and Oda planted it in the first few pages. Now we have to talk about the scene Oda chose to open Chapter 1 with. Not Luffy, not Shanks, not even the ocean. Gold Roger's execution, a man kneeling before a crowd, about to die and smiling. That is the first image in One Piece. Not a battle, not a treasure, a death. And from that death, Roger speaks one of the most carefully constructed sentences in manga history. He doesn't say the treasure exists. He doesn't give coordinates. He doesn't beg. He says, "You want my treasure, you can have it. I left everything I gathered in one place." Now read that again. I left everything I gathered in one place. Not I hid it, not I buried it, not I locked it away, left as in deliberately, as in intentionally easily accessible, as in I want someone to find it. Roger didn't hide the One Piece from the world. He staged a treasure hunt for the right person. And the reason this matters for the ending is enormous, because it reframes what the One Piece actually is. This isn't a treasure that needs to be excavated from darkness. It's a treasure that's been waiting for someone ready to understand it. And what does that suggest about Luffy? It suggests that Luffy reaching Laugh Tale isn't about being the strongest or the luckiest or even the most determined. It's about being the one who gets it, who understands what Roger left, and what it means for the world. The Pirate King title, introduced in Chapter 1 as Luffy's goal, is almost certainly going to mean something completely different from what it sounds like. Roger was called Pirate King, but what Roger actually did was free information that the world government had spent centuries suppressing, which means Pirate King might not be a title of conquest, it might be a title of revelation, and this is where everything starts, connecting in ways that should make your hands shake a little. Here's something that should have broken the internet when it was finally confirmed, but somehow still doesn't get enough attention. Luffy never wanted to be a hero. He says it in Chapter 1. He says it directly, almost offensively. When a character calls him out on acting heroic, Luffy pushes back. He's not saving people because he's driven by justice. He's not gathering a crew because he wants an army. He doesn't even want to be the strongest fighter in the world. Not really. He wants to be free. And here's why that matters more than almost anything else in the series. Every major villain in One Piece is someone who chose power as a substitute for freedom. Kaido wanted to die gloriously because he couldn't feel alive. Doflamingo constructed an entire kingdom to control what he couldn't understand. Even the world nobles, the celestial dragons, are imprisoned by their own bloodline, trapped in masks and bubbles, enslaved to a history they had no part in making. The antagonists of One Piece aren't evil because they're malicious. They're tragic because they're unfree. And Luffy, from Chapter 1, is the walking antithesis of every one of them. He's not trying to change the world. He's not trying to overthrow the government. He just wants to sail, find people worth sailing with, and go on adventures that matter. And that's exactly what makes him dangerous to every power structure in the story, because freedom, genuine, unapologetic, infectious freedom, is more threatening to systems of control than any army or devil fruit. Now here's where Joy Boy enters the picture. Joy Boy is introduced retroactively in the story. We don't hear his name in Chapter 1, but his essence is there, because Joy Boy, as we now understand him, was someone who promised the world something it wasn't ready to receive. A promise made in the Void Century, broken, waiting to be fulfilled. And Zunisha says it directly. Joy Boy has returned, not reincarnated, not replaced, returned. Luffy isn't following in Joy Boy's footsteps. Luffy is Joy Boy's answer, the will that couldn't be extinguished, routed through generations of inherited purpose, landing in the exact person who laughs when he should be afraid and keeps moving when he should stop. It was in his nature from page 1. Oda just let us believe it was personality. It was always fate. The kind of fate you choose so freely it doesn't feel like fate at all. Let's zoom out literally. The world of One Piece is divided by the Red Line, an enormous intercontinental wall that circles the globe. The Grand Line cuts perpendicular to it. The result is 4 seas, each isolated, each unequal in power and access. Now here's the question Oda has been building toward since Chapter 1. Even if we didn't have the vocabulary to ask it, what happens when the Red Line falls because it's coming? You can feel it in the architecture of the story. The Void Century, Joy Boy, ancient weapons, the Revolutionary Army. Everything points toward a reckoning with the physical structure of the world, not just its political one. And here's what Chapter 1 gives us. Quietly, the ocean. Luffy doesn't just love the ocean. He needs it. Freedom in One Piece is always represented by open water. No walls, no barriers, no borders, just horizon. The Red Line isn't just a plot obstacle. It's a symbol of everything the world government has built. Artificial separation to maintain control. 4 seas means 4 populations that can't freely interact, can't trade knowledge, can't build solidarity, can't recognize each other's suffering. That's not geography, that's policy. And the ancient weapons, Poseidon, Pluton, Uranus, have the power to reshape those physical structures. The all blue that Sanji dreams of, a mythical sea where all the world's fish coexist, is only possible if those separations disappear. Sanji's dream isn't a cooking fantasy, it's a prophecy. And here's the quiet brilliance of how Oda seeded this in Chapter 1. The very first thing we see after Roger's death is the world changing. Pirates flood the seas, the great pirate era begins. Roger's execution didn't silence the dream, it multiplied it, one man's death. A world in motion that is the template for the ending. Whatever Luffy reveals at Laugh Tale, whatever the One Piece turns out to be, it won't be something that ends the story quietly. It will be something that detonates across the world the same way Roger's last words did. A truth so undeniable that containing it becomes impossible. And the world government knows this. They've always known this. That's why they've been afraid of a D. That's why they burned Ohara. That's why they'll do anything to stop someone from reaching the end of the Grand Line with open eyes and a voice loud enough to be heard. The final war isn't coming because Luffy decided to fight. It's coming because the world has been building pressure since the Void Century. And Luffy is the match. Now let's pull the threads together, because here's where it stops being analysis and starts being something else. Look at chapter 1's dialogue from a different angle. Luffy says, "I'm going to be king of the pirates," simple, childish even, the kind of thing a kid says before they understand what it costs. But then watch how Oda constructs every major beat of the story around one persistent, ridiculous question. What does it actually mean to be king of the pirates? Whitebeard, dying at Marineford, says Roger wasn't seeking a throne. He was seeking something else. Companionship, adventure, the answer to a question he didn't even know how to phrase. Roger himself never called himself king in a governing sense. He was called king because he got there first, because he could. And Luffy has never once talked about ruling anything. He doesn't want subordinates. He doesn't want territory. He doesn't want tribute. He wants to find the One Piece. And then, and this is crucial, then he wants his friends to be free. That's it. That's Monkey D. Luffy's entire ambition. When you strip away the title, now go back to chapter 1. Shanks loses his arm saving Luffy, and when Luffy cries, not for the arm, but from guilt, from gratitude, from a feeling too big for a child's chest to hold, Shanks says something devastating in its simplicity. "I just bet my arm on the new era." He bet his arm on Luffy, on the era Luffy would create. Shanks, who knew Roger, who was on Roger's ship as a cabin boy, who possibly knows more about the One Piece than almost anyone alive, looked at this crying kid and went all in. That moment is the emotional contract of One Piece. Everything that happens after, every island, every battle, every sacrifice, every nakama gathered, is Luffy making good on a bet someone else placed in him before. He was old enough to understand the stakes. The ending isn't just about reaching Laugh Tale, it's about proving Shanks right. And here's what this tells us about Oda's method. He writes the emotional truth first. The plot is built to service that truth, not the other way around. The ending of One Piece, whatever it looks like on a plot level, will be emotionally about this. A kid who was told he could be something, in a moment of absolute vulnerability, spending his entire life becoming exactly that. Not for fame, not for power, but because someone believed. Oda doesn't write backwards from plot, he writes backwards from feeling. And the feeling of chapter 1 is unmistakable. Something extraordinary is about to begin, and it was supposed to. So let's say it plainly, the ending of One Piece. As supported by every layer of foreshadowing we've walked through, Luffy reaches Laugh Tale, the One Piece is revealed, not as gold, not as a weapon, but as a record, the true history of the world, the account of the void century that the world government has been erasing for 800 years. A history that proves the celestial dragons built their power on a lie, that the world government was founded not to protect people, but to protect a specific group's dominance, that Joy Boy made a promise to the people of the ancient kingdom, a promise of freedom, of equal seas, of a world without artificial walls, and was stopped before he could keep it. And Luffy, upon learning this, doesn't give a political speech. He does what Luffy always does. He laughs not because it's funny, but because it's so absurd, that the world has been afraid of this truth for 800 years, that people have been killed for it, that islands have been burned for it, that a man sat in front of the entire world at his own execution and tried to tell everyone, and they still didn't hear it. And then laughing, he shares it. Not strategically, not carefully, just opens his mouth and tells the world, the way Roger told his crew, the way a child tells a secret not to weaponize it, but because secrets were never supposed to be kept in the first place. And what happens next is what chapter 1 already told us. The world moves the same way it moved when Roger died, except this time it's not an era of pirates that begins, it's something older, something Joy Boy tried to start and couldn't finish, an era of people who know the truth, who can't unknow it, who have to decide for themselves what to do with it. The red line falls, not necessarily as a dramatic explosion, though it might be that too, but as a conceptual collapse. The idea that some people are born above others, that some seas are separate by divine right, that power is legitimized by history rather than humanity, all of it gone, and Monkey D. Luffy, who never wanted to be a hero, who never wanted to change the world, who just wanted to be free and find the greatest adventure there was, accidentally changes everything, because that's what Joy Boy does. That's what the D means, not a title, not a bloodline, a tendency. The people who carry it don't try to start revolutions. Revolutions just happen around them, because they refuse to accept limits that were never real. And it all started in chapter 1 in a barrel with a hat, and a boy who said, "I'm going to be king of the pirates." He didn't know yet that king wasn't the point. Freedom was always the point. Here's the thought I want to leave you with. Most stories hide their endings. They protect the mystery, guard the twist, save the revelation for the final page. Oda did something different. He put the ending in chapter 1 in plain view, and trusted that the journey itself would change how we see it. Because if you read chapter 1 today, right now, knowing everything you know, it doesn't feel like a beginning anymore. It feels like a promise about freedom, about inherited will, about the kind of person who refuses to be contained by a barrel, or a bloodline, or a world that tells them what they're allowed to dream. And maybe that's the real secret of One Piece. Not what the treasure is, not what the One Piece contains, but the fact that Oda trusted his readers across 27 years to be the kind of people who'd still be watching, who'd still be curious, who'd still believe. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If everything was already shown in chapter 1, are we watching the story? Or have we been decoding it all along? Drop a comment below. What details detail from chapter 1 do you think mattered most? The one you missed the first time? The one that hits different now? And if this broke your brain in the best possible way, share it with whoever you know is still sleeping on this series. The story isn't over, but now you know how it ends.